Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the panel on emerging technologies and the future of arms control. I am Andre Rosendorf from the Peace Research Center Prague and the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have a very special panel prepared for you, some amazing guests and quite diverse backgrounds. I'll start by introducing our panelists in alphabetical order. We have Branka Marian, who is a senior researcher at Project Plowshares, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and a lecturer at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Her work focuses on the military and security implications of emerging technologies, including AI and autonomous weapons, as well as trends in warfare and civilian protection. Then we have Cyril Martel, who is a head of the Biosecurity Division at the Center for Biosecurity and Biopreparedness in the Danish Ministry of Health and has worked with the WHO and national authorities on outbreak preparedness. He leads Denmark's efforts on biosecurity and dual-use risk management, advising on biotechnology exports control, and the BWC. Next, we have Elke Schwartz. She's a professor of political theory at Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on the ethics and politics of emerging technologies, including AI and autonomous weapons. She also serves as a vice chair of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control and is the author of the book Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies. What a cool name, by the way. And finally, we have Tong Zhao, who is a senior fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program and China Center at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a non-resident researcher at the Princeton University. He studies nuclear deterrence, arms control, and emerging tech with a focus on China, and is the author of the book Political Drivers of China's Changing Nuclear Policy. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping first. So we'll have 2 rounds of discussion first. Then we'll follow with the questions from the audience. Give me a second. So I'll start with a little bit of a provocation to get the discussion started. So we hear a lot about emerging technologies and they're potentially being game changers. But obviously, some of this hype is warranted, some of it is perhaps not. So as a first question, I'd really like to hear from our panelists which recent developments they find truly matter in their respective fields, and what challenges or opportunities might they present for the future of arms control. And let's start with Branka.
Thank you so much, Andrzej. It's so nice to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation to join you. So essentially, I'll start with where I think the concern is and then move on to sort of more of the hype. And the actual concern is really about AI in decision-making and the way in which AI influences or shapes decision-making. So this is AI decision support systems that aid with targeting. This is sort of the decisions sort of that are being more broadly taken based on recommendations of AI systems. I don't know if you've seen the recent news where a US Major General talked about the fact that he has a bit of a personal relationship with chat. And of course he means ChatGPT, but obviously he's not using the ChatGPT that we all use. He's using a closed sort of system. But it's really important to understand that the reliance on these systems by current sort of military decision makers is already happening. That's not something off in the future. There are recommender systems, recommendation systems that are being worked on, prediction systems across different militaries and different stages of development that are going to influence and are influencing decision making. Now, why does that matter? Well, yesterday we had this discussion on nuclear where AI was sort of presented as the decision maker. But I want to sort of, again, be more provocative and make you think about the fact that AI doesn't necessarily have to be the decision maker to have already influenced the decision-making process. And so, for example, that's, if you're basing certain decisions on data, or those systems are shaping sort of your perspective, and this is technology and this is science, and you can design systems to nudge decisions in particular ways. Systems can influence sort of our thinking, and that's where I think that the less maybe visible, but the more critical for all of us is precisely this role in this, the shaping of decision making. And we need to, so the challenge for arms control is, how do you capture that in governance, right? Like, how do you capture the fact that even if you have a human in control, that human's agency has been reduced to the point that it really is maybe the human is simply approving certain actions. And Professor Ingold Bode, for example, has been talking about human agency a lot. And our discussion at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which I started following about 10 years ago, has really evolved to try and capture this idea of human agency in sort of a relation to human control. And when I speak later, I'll touch a little bit more on how do you actually operationalize that, and how do you ensure that that can be done in terms of governance. And then there's the sort of the challenge of multi-purpose. So I was just in the space discussion, and we said, we should talk about multi-use and multi-purpose versus dual use. A lot of companies now are now getting money for dual-use AI technologies. $28 billion as of September 2025 was invested in companies, in specifically two functions: counter-drone technologies and startups that are doing sort of more autonomous targeting and target recognition. There are about 17,600 scale-ups across NATO countries alone that sort of say they're dual use. So you have to understand how challenging that is for governance. And then let me wrap up with where the hype is, the narrative that these systems, these decision support systems, are somehow magical solutions to warfare, that they are the all-knowing, the better, the experts. That doesn't, war is not a lab. We don't have war contexts or battle spaces that provide lab conditions. So I think it's really important for us to consider what is good marketing, and I know Elke has written a lot about this and will speak about this, but I think it's really important to understand some of the people who are selling the technology are really great at marketing. But war is not, going to provide them the kinds of marketing solutions that they're offering us. And it's not, most importantly, for us and all of us who have to sort of address the consequences of some of that decision-making, the fallout, the humanitarian implications. That is still something I think that we have to keep in mind. So really thinking through the hype and the implications to say, what is actually the technology doing, and what is possible with that technology, and what are its implications. Let me end there.
Perfect timing. Thank you. And we'll follow up with Elke.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This is very exciting. Branka and I kind of look at the same things. So of course the technologies that we will be speaking about are very similar, and the technologies that are of greatest concern. So these AI decision support systems are certainly also technologies that are increasingly encroaching into more domains of warfare. So initially AI was a technology that was discussed in relation to autonomous weapon systems, and the question is, to what degree should a human decision maker make the final decision, and so on and so forth. That has distributed along much broader and wider remits of activities and tasks, and I think that for me is a crucial aspect to take into consideration. It isn't, artificial intelligence in itself isn't a technology that is a thing. It's a system, and its intrinsic internal capacities and capabilities are expansive. That means it is likely that more and more domains will fall under the sway of artificial intelligence. This is, of course, supported by the ever-present credo that it is inevitable that everything will be AI-enabled, and we all will factor into as human elements into an AI ecosystem. I want to stress that nothing is inevitable. And so I worry very much that we often, in the discussions about arms control, disarmament, the technology itself, we often base our understanding of how we relate to technology on an incomplete and perhaps an erroneous relationship that we humans have to the technology, specifically a technology that isn't just a physical prosthesis, but also takes on cognitive functions. It's much more intrusive and shaping our logics than we typically are willing to acknowledge, and I think that matters. We also have a tendency to overestimate the technological capability itself. Now that is supported, of course, by this very loud hype, and I'll talk about this a little bit later again. And we underestimate how the systems logic come to prioritize how ideas of risks and threats are conceived and repackaged, and how this will then shape our relationship to the use of violence, and also tragically, how this will shape our acceptance of civilian deaths. So I think it's important that we recalibrate our understanding of artificial intelligence not as a magic sauce or a magic kind of creature or a natural force that will inevitably happen upon us and we must contend with it, but rather it's a technology that can be limited, that is extremely useful if it is limited, and that is much more perilous if we allow its logic to shape how we think about politics and warfare, about social affairs and government itself. And so what I've observed, and I'll end with that for now, is that, and the basic challenges with AI remain, right? The systems are brittle, they're not necessarily that useful for warfare, especially in dynamic contexts. They're really, really good at limited closed environments where things can be controlled a little bit better, where you don't have this like wild dynamic of data becoming so obsolete so fast. So those challenges remain, even with large language models, which is the latest rage. So studies have shown that the trade-off between using a large language model and the fact that you have to verify, because large language models hallucinate, is quite substantial, so you're not actually making time gains. Studies have also shown that it only needs 250 documents to subvert the training of a large language model and kind of, undermine its utility. So it's very brittle and it remains brittle. But what we're seeing at the moment concerning the hype is an advocacy of AI, autonomy, which is often packaged within speeches that suggest that war can be won swiftly and decisively if only we had more of this type of technology. And then increasingly we're seeing a blending of the business logic with Silicon Valley-style tech cultures with warfare. And then the hype of tech is becoming a hype of war. And I think we're on a slippery slope towards prioritizing war over other political means to end conflict.
Again, perfect timing. Thank you. All right. We'll now switch maybe a little bit to some extent from the AI or autonomous weapons area to the nuclear realm. So I invite Tong to share his insights with us.
Thank you. In terms of whether there is hype in how emerging technologies affect nuclear systems, I think in many cases we are seeing old technologies with new applications. If we look at the so-called exotic delivery systems that Russia is developing and some other countries are researching, nuclear-powered cruise missile, nuclear-powered long-range torpedo, those are not really new technologies, but increasingly integrated with more capable AI and autonomous technology, which is why I think they become quite concerning today. They reported China's development of FOBS system, fractional orbital bombardment system, is becoming a new weapon, not because of the old FOBS technology, but perhaps because China is reportedly experimenting with combining FOBS with a long-range glider warhead, which will really increase the global reach of the weapon, the surprising way this weapon can be used, and also it can increase the precision of this long-range weapon as well as its penetration against defensive systems. Golden Dome, I think, also faces many of the same old physical constraints, except much lower launch cost. I'm not sure how revolutionary the proposed interceptor technologies really is. Even if we look at the directed energy missile defense technology, it appears more evolutionary than revolutionary. But I think a key point is the real and legitimate debate around the military effectiveness of these old systems and new applications of them gives rise to genuine threat perception gaps among adversary countries. For example, China genuinely does not appear to understand American concern about its FOB system. In American mind, this system can be a really useful counterforce weapon. It can be used in a very surprising way against leadership and key command and control nodes. But that threat perception is not shared by China. And in the American case, I don't think the United States really understands Chinese concern that the space-based interceptors proposed under Golden Dome are viewed by many Chinese experts as basically ASAT weapons based in space under the disguise of missile defense interceptors. That interpretation is likely to lead to Chinese doubling down on its counterspace investment. I think one particular concern for me regarding emerging technologies is many of them further enable rapid response capabilities and rapid response doctrines. Look at the early warning system, a technology that is becoming more widespread and available today, is leading to newcomer, including China, adopting a launch on warning posture. This is really a Cold War concept, but it's becoming more risky today because we now have maneuverable missiles. It's much harder to predict their intended targets. We have nuclear conventional dual-capable missiles. It's much harder to distinguish the nature of an incoming missile threat. And in the Golden Dome, if we look at the key element of space-based interceptors, we have to understand that these interceptors are supposed to work very early on after enemy missiles are launched. So there may not be time to accurately assess or to accurately distinguish among enemy missile attack or enemy missile tests or simply non-military rocket launches. And especially since we have maneuverable missiles that can change trajectory even after the boost phase concludes. So I think that makes it much harder to predict the target and to understand enemy intent before the perceived window of interception is closed. So the rapid response requirement and the incentive to do that, I think, is creating new risks. And I'm not sure the major powers have really thought through these implications since they focus so much on developing deterrence. So I think it's the job of our community to conduct concrete work. There is so much that can be done through research, through policy debate, through raising awareness across the main players to understand and address these new challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong. And now we'll move to Cyril.
Thank you. Modern biological weapons programs started shortly before World War II, and all of them have been relying on naturally occurring agents, naturally occurring microorganisms and toxins to produce weapons. And the thing is, those biological agents, they're not very suitable to make weapons. They can be very dangerous, they can be lethal, we all know that from outbreaks and pandemics and so on, but they lack some of the characteristics that would make them good weapons. Namely, they're unpredictable, they are also very susceptible to the environment and so on. So that has largely limited the usefulness of biological weapons, and that's probably one of the explanations why there have been so few incidents in modern times. However, there are some technological developments now that are starting to alter that calculus, and I think I'd like to name 3 of them today and elaborate a little on them. The first one is synthetic biology, the second one is the convergence with AI, and the third one is the convergence with nanotechnology. So the first one, synthetic biology, has been on the radar for a couple of decades already, but it's really starting to mature and come of age in the past few years. Synthetic biology is the field that is interested in modifying and designing life, and it does so by modifying the genome of living organisms and trying to give them new properties. And this is something that scientists have been trying to do for a long time, also in bioweapons program. The Soviets, for example, have tried to create new pathogens that could be resistant over multiple types of treatments, antibiotics. But modifying genome has been something that has been traditionally very expensive and technically demanding and unreliable, and organisms have had a tendency to reverse to their normal properties, meaning even if you could confer some antibiotic resistance to some of them, they would quickly ditch it for reasons of efficiency and survival. However, in the past few years, there have been some new tools, and one of them, maybe you heard about, is called CRISPR, that have considerably changed our ability to modify genomes. It has made it very simple, very cheap, very accessible. Nowadays, almost every student that graduates from college within biology knows how to use that tool. And it has also allowed for stable editing and modifying genomes. So this has really given us a tool on how to make modification. What it has not given us is which modification we should make in order to achieve a desired effect. And that's where the second technology kicks in, the convergence of AI and biology. And here I'm not talking about general purpose AI and large language models. There have been some studies that show that the potential for misuse of those tools is quite low at the moment. What I'm referring to is domain-specific AI. So tools that are specifically designed for biology. And we're talking about a number of software, a number of algorithms that have the ability to predict the effect of a specific sequence. And this is something that has been traditionally very, very difficult and actually impossible for scientists. Normally, we have tried as scientists to find organisms or individuals with certain qualities, and then we've looked back and tried to see which mutations gave them those properties. But that has been almost impossible to reproduce in other organisms or even in a strain of the same organism. But nowadays, we have some software that can do that. There has been recently in Science an article, maybe you've been aware of it, of scientists from Microsoft that have tried to order DNA sequence from commercial manufacturers. And normally you can do that, but if you try to order a sequence that is dangerous, for example, a sequence from a pathogen that is on a control list, then a screening software kicks in and you're not receiving the order you've made. And they've tried to use their own AI and ask the AI, can you make a sequence that would look very different but have exactly the same effect? And they have succeeded in ordering a large number of dangerous sequences. And this is really a technology that is still maturing. So, how reliable it is, which percentage of success you have is up for debate, but it is quite likely that it will get better and better with time. The last thing I'd like to point out is the convergence with nanotechnology. Even though you know which modifications to make and you have the tools to make them, you're still working with living organisms. And living organisms tend to be difficult to work with. They get contaminated, they die, they produce waste products that have very bad effect on their efficacy and culture and so on. So now you can use nanotechnology to get rid of those organisms and replace them by small particles, for example, small bubbles of lipids that can contain a payload. So that way you don't need to work anymore with microorganisms. You can work with those bubbles, which are really produced from chemicals, but show some particularities that you can associate with microorganisms, such as the ability to infect specific type of cells or specific type of organs. And the consequence of all those technology and so on is that it now allows for an increase in the usefulness of biological weapons. It can also allow for a smaller footprint in order to produce those weapons. And the combination of the two is probably going to be a driver into the acquisition of biological weapons by state actors in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to move to more expertise-specific questions now, and we'll start with Tong. I'd like to ask you, well, China is making headlines recently with nuclear modernization efforts and expansion, including in areas like hypersonics and other emerging technologies. And my question to you is, how should we interpret these developments for China's nuclear posture in the context of the third nuclear age, and what do they imply for arms control dialogue with other nuclear powers?
I think for China's leader, Mr. Xi, when he gave speech early on during his tenure, he told the rocket force officials that China needs to develop capability that make the enemy fear the most. So I think the nuclear buildup is really driven by effort to maximize coercive leverage, especially with the United States. And as a result, the risk is, I think there has been less thought devoted to issues of how Chinese buildup would lead to others' reactions, including how this might affect crisis instability. And the increasing lack of internal expert input in policy deliberation, I think, makes this worse. A challenge today is China does not appear to fear anymore about an arms race with the United States, given the very high self-confidence in China about its capability to outcompete the United States and build more and better capabilities in a cheaper way and in a faster way than the United States. So for people who wish that the US, for example, could compel China to the negotiating table by building up American capabilities, I think it's debatable whether that approach would work in the near term. I think this challenge really highlights the fundamental need to start with building shared risk awareness. If China can be persuaded that certain capabilities or postures cause risk and downsides for its own security and deterrence, it will have incentive to take unilateral measures to address them. This applies to the issues of launch on warning or the development of FOBs capability or China's massive deployment of conventional nuclear dual-capable missiles. The good news is the Chinese government is still very open to discussing strategic risk reduction, as recently reaffirmed by the government. And many nuclear and emerging technology issues can be framed as part of strategic risk and risk reduction. And therefore, I think European countries, European Union in particular, can lead on this, given the Europeans' traditional stance in promoting international norms, its unique political leverage over China because of Chinese interest in maintaining good relations with European countries, and the fact that European countries have a really good expert community. One example to work with China in the near term is to see if they can jointly express concern or opposition against the development and deployment of exotic nuclear delivery systems. Another strategy to engage with China is to look at the trend that China is becoming a less, the power relationship between China and the West is becoming less asymmetric, which brings up new opportunities, including outer space. When China has launched a warning, its reliance on early warning system increases. There will be growing common interest in non-interference in each other's early warning assets. And I think allies of the United States could support the United States to be more open to discuss the issue of missile defense, because China is also becoming a more capable player on this issue and have ambitions to have layered missile defense system for its own. So if China accepts a discussion on missile defense, that would be great. It would be a great opportunity to discuss both sides, strategic offensive and strategic defensive capabilities. But even if China rejects a discussion on missile defense, that could remove one talking point from the table that China uses to not engage in nuclear arms control talks. I will end by also suggesting Western countries can be a little more open and pragmatic in engaging China on its arms control counter proposal, i.e. no first use. This is not to make any concession to China, but to use this issue to highlight challenges that China needs to address to make its no first use credible, and therefore to encourage a more self-reflective dialogue between the two sides.
Thank you. All right, let's go back to the question of AI and autonomy. I'd like to ask Branka. So responsibility is becoming somewhat of a new buzzword when it comes to regulation of AI in the military domain. But how do states actually make it real? What does responsibility look like in practice to you, and how can arms control or governance initiatives turn these principles into tangible outcomes?
Thank you, Anders. I think responsibility is sometimes, you think one of those words that's thrown around to, and everybody has a different understanding, and sometimes it's like, you keep using that word, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. But I think what's really critical is getting a sort of a clear stance where different countries are. So let me I'll touch on sort of more the definitions, and then I'll move sort of to the governance, and then what sort of are the practical and the technical challenges. So in terms of the definitions, like since I arrived here, I've been making small talk, and I have to remind myself, Europeans don't do small talk. So there needs to be, there is a need for a bit of translation. What do countries actually mean with responsible use of military AI? And there are thick and thin understandings. And I can tell you from a country like Canada, in my engagement with the Canadian Department of National Defense, that it is a country that perceives itself as a responsible, military, a responsible state actor. And as such, for that country, there's, I would say, maybe a sort of the middle ground, the medium position, the level of thickness, because Canada, like most middle powers right now, is kind of struggling, right, given the geopolitical realities I think that's outlined, to sort of see how it can navigate the current geopolitical and technological changes. At the same time, and autonomy are really appealing, and they're really appealing to a lot of European countries as well, because AI is a force multiplier or a force enabler for smaller militaries. Whether we're talking about autonomous systems and loitering munitions, whether we're talking about wider use of AI, and I think that's where Tong is right. The scary aspect of that is the speed and scale, right, that these technologies will allow. And so we need to get a better understanding of what does a responsible use look like? And that is something that has been discussed for several years now in thinking through responsibility throughout the life cycle of systems and throughout the life cycle of weapons. And for example, the Canadians that I've been engaging with at the Department of National Defense are really cognizant of that. And the other thing that they worry about, which is I think important to highlight and sometimes isn't highlighted in this discussion, is the decommissioning of systems, because they're worried about some of the biometric data, for example, that was left behind in Afghanistan, those kinds of systems. So having really that, responsibility by design be at the sort of forefront. Now, what does that mean with sort of the governance, mechanisms that we have in place? So I was engaging with the Canadian Department of National Defense and Portugal on the US-led political declaration, Responsible Military AI. We don't know what the status, I don't know if the Americans in the room know, we don't know what the status of that political declaration is given the current administration. We're just hoping that they haven't found it yet and that it'll just sort of stay in the background. But what has been good about that process, for example, Portugal and Canada co-led the working group on accountability, is really to think through some of those aspects I mentioned at the outset, right? Which is human agency and control, like how do we really actually have accountability? And that's where you get into really sort of the nitty-gritty of some of this, which is what is the level of understandability of a system that a human operator or a military commander needs to have in order to be held accountable for that system. And so to have that, you have to talk about testing, you have to talk about evaluation, you have to talk about training. And I have to tell you, a lot of countries still don't have the capacity in this space, right? Though we've been discussing autonomous weapons for almost a decade now, there's still a need to bring up the capacity of a lot of countries in that space so we get into the concreteness, not the hypotheticals of what AI can do in the military space, but really what does this look like in practice. Then there's the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which keeps kind of muddling through, but 2026 will be a somewhat decisive year, right? Because the new mandate will have to be looked at and we'll have to see, okay, what has happened. I joke that I've aged prematurely in the CCW, but what I think is good about the CCW is that it has been an incubator for a topic that was very sophisticated for a large number of countries, right? And so we have to see what can happen in that space that will contribute to responsibility. And I think, Tong, you've been kind of pointing to confidence building measures, to norms, like how do we work out some of those issues at multilateral levels, but also bilateral levels and trilateral. And this is where middle powers can really start engaging with each other to sort of think about, like, what do you do in the current moment where the possibility or probability of some sort of legally binding instrument, it doesn't seem very likely, right? So what can happen in the medium term? And that's where we've seen actually middle powers step up. So for example, the Netherlands has done a really great job of positioning itself as an interlocutor with the re-aim process. And that's the Republic of Korea as well and other countries that have stepped up into that space. So next year again is somewhat decisive because we'll have to see what does the third re-aim actually do, right? So there's been the blueprint for action, and then sort of the action documents that came out of the Republic of Korea meeting, and now is it going to be action for action? Like what are we going to see in Spain early next year that will sort of deliver on some of that responsibility? And then there's, of course, the first committee, the UNGA process. The discussions this year weren't as, I think, maybe, let's say, successful or deep as we would have liked to see to have sort of a better understanding what can happen in a broader dialogue. But it's nonetheless important to have those discussions. And I know yesterday there was some talk about, like, why bring up the use of nuclear and AI into that space, but it's important. That's where all the countries are. You need to talk about what are the implications of this because, of course, the effects are widespread. And so then we get into sort of the practicalities of how do you actually ensure. So I already talked about sort of understandability, but we also have to think again throughout the life cycle. What are sort of the the sort of fail-safes, what is built into that really research, testing, evaluation, development, deployment to prevent some of, some misuse. And then that's where we come across some real technical issues. And that's, for example, we have to deal with alignment faking. So that's where an AI system does something during the testing phase that you expect it to do, it you want it to do, but then in deployment, it does something entirely different, right? And that's going to be a technical challenge. I think Elke outlined the brittleness, of these systems, and then what happens in actual deployment. And we already see sort of power-seeking AI. We see sort of, the ways in which during the testing and evaluation phase, you can have a different outcome than you have in the deployment phase. So we need much more engagement between the researchers and the states parties, and then we have these private industry, which Elke will talk about, that really steps into that space and provides, I think, a lot of hype, and that's not helpful. We really need to understand these are safety critical contexts. In a safety critical context, when you're deploying a system, what are all the measures that you have to have in place? So I think yesterday, one of the participants urged us to think about, like, what does that actually mean then for arms control? Like, how do you do arms control differently now? And we have to use some of the same tools that we've always used, including competence building measures, including sort of that, bilateral, trilateral dialogues. We have to use all of those things plus. And we have to really think about how different this technology is than, for example, landmines, right? Like, you could get countries to agree on something because the military utility might have been lower, for example, or the appeal isn't as wide. So let me end there. I have a lot of thoughts about, like, let's make this a practical thing that can be done and should be done, really. In the meantime, even if we say, okay, the current environment is challenging and difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Branka. Okay, let's go back to the issue of biological weapons. So emerging technologies in the life sciences often have dual-use nature. In fact, this is something that Cyril is an expert on, offering, on the one hand, potentially benefits, but also misuse, or potential for misuse, let's say. What role can Europe play in shaping international standards under the BWC and export controls like the Australia Group, and how can global, regional, and national actors best coordinate to manage these risks, in your opinion?
Thank you. I think the critical concept to understand when you try to answer that question is that dual use within biotechnology has been broadening considerably compared to just a few years ago. Back in the good old days, if you wanted to make sure that malevolent actors would not access biological weapons, you had to limit their access to a few pathogens and some knowledge related to those pathogens and to a few very discrete steps in the production process. Nowadays, because of the technological developments that I've mentioned, the possibility for misuse is applying now to a lot of different methods and a lot of different fields that have not been traditionally associated with biological weapons. That means now that it is almost impossible for a national agency to be expert in all the methods that can be misused. And it might be a cliche, but also the very fast evolution, the very fast development in those fields make it impossible to keep up. The other important concept is that we have been focused for the last 20 years on non-state actors and preventing them from acquiring biological weapons. So our methods of control and denial have been very much focused on an adversary that had limited technical capabilities, and that's no longer the case. I think what my colleague Tong was saying earlier about China very much applies to biology and biotechnology. So export control is no longer the way to prevent misuse of technology and acquisition of biological weapons. So the logical conclusion of that is that the best thing that the EU can do in that field is help us pool our national resources so we have a better understanding of what we are working with. I understand, I heard through the grapevine that it's something that the EU is working on, and that might be some research opportunities for that next year in the Horizon program. And I think this is a really important activity. One of the caveats is that traditionally science and technology exchange has been very much limited by the fear of information risk, because we were trapped in that thinking that we were confronted to low-tech adversaries. Then it made a lot of sense to try not to give too many details, not to engage in technical exchanges and discussions with fear that it would lead to leakages of that technology. But again, since we're dealing now with adversaries that are much more advanced, this thinking doesn't make sense anymore, or at least it needs to be seriously reevaluated. So there is a need in certain forums, such as the BTWC or the Australia group, to very much accept the fact that we need to talk about those things, and we need to talk in detail, and we need to try some of those things nationally and share the results of those studies with other like-minded countries. The other thing is, because it is almost impossible for national agencies to be experts in all those methods, we very much rely on scientists to control their work, to make sure that they do not create unnecessary risks. And this is a difficult field to operate, and I'm out almost every week talking to scientists, talking to people that have experience with the technology, and it is very difficult for them to understand that their technology can be misused and that their technology can be of interest for some adversary state actors, and they don't see themselves as part of this big game that you guys are much more familiar with. And therefore there is a very big need to come up with new tools, new awareness-raising methods, new narratives that can really engage them. One of them is try to conflate this problem of dual use with some other problems that they're more aware of. In particular, fear of getting their IP stolen, or their publications or their inventions stolen. That's probably the things that scientists and private companies are the more interested in, or the more receptive to. And therefore there is a need to try to conflate those narratives together. I think the last thing that the EU can do is try to encourage the establishment of national biosecurity system, because again, that expertise that we need, that contact, the direct contact with scientists and evaluation of their project and understanding of what we're working on, and guidance in terms of how to mitigate dual use risk, can only happen through national systems. And I think I'll stop here.
Perfect, thank you. All right, my last question goes to Elke. And I'd like you to address this dimension of the private sector's involvement in all of these developments. So I'm sorry, give me a second. So how is the growing influence of technology elites and venture capital, so figures like Elon Musk, Sam Altman, and Peter Thiel, reshaping the moral and strategic foundations of AI development, particularly as they promote these commercial visions that affect decisions about military applications of AI? And what does this mean for the future of arms control in terms of the necessity of involving these actors?
Thank you. 5 minutes, right? So I want to start by saying that it's really important to think about the practicalities of the technology and think about regulation and, responsible artificial intelligence or responsible technology in relation to the technological capabilities and capacities and characteristics. That's what I've spent 10 years of my life doing. I was thinking about how the capabilities or capacities of the technology challenges the ethical frameworks that we have for warfare and generally about thinking about life. So that remains important. But if we really want to think about responsibility or responsible artificial intelligence, we can't just look to the technology because there are other dynamics that are in play. And in some ways, we can then have to square the circle between what some of these private actors are saying that are very dominant and very loud in that space, and what we consider to be responsible artificial intelligence or responsible type technologies. And sometimes there's a almost insurmountable tension. And I think it's crucial, or in the last year or so, I've really zoomed out a bit, because unless we take these dynamics into consideration, I think policymakers will remain reactive to the dynamics. So, you know, TEWV measures should be put in place, but we have to be sure that they're not just reactive to a different kind of dynamic that is happening. The philosopher Simone Weil in the 1930s observed that in modern war, there's always an indissolvable melange between business and military affairs. And we have that condition today as well. And I think it's getting supercharged with a new kind of actor. So I think there's a steady, or there has been over the last decade, a steady, some might call it a hostile takeover of venture capital style enterprises in defense. This includes the encroachment of big tech into military, so the big companies that we're all familiar with, but also the rise of new defense startups, unicorns that are valued over $1 billion US, and the establishment of movements, which is mostly witnessed in the United States. And all these actors have very strong private equity ties, including many venture capital interests. Now, venture capital is also called risk capital. So what does that mean? So venture capital invests in young startups that are unproven, that need to go to different kinds of money lenders other than banks because they're too risky, because they're unproven. So they have a great idea, they need some capital. That capital then is thrown into this startup, and hopefully the startup will thrive. Now, venture capital companies do this for many startups. It's risk capital, but the risk is diversified across a portfolio. So a venture capital company will invest in, like, let's say 10 startups. Only maybe 1 or 2 will actually make it beyond 2 years or 5 years. The gains in the valuation of that company, or those 2 companies, is so high that any investment in those other 8 companies is made up for. So that means these startups need to grow very fast and very, very large, very quickly. So that's the principle of venture capital investing, which is now taking hold of the defense sector. So there's a risk, but the question really is the risk to whom? Because the companies themselves, the venture capital money givers, are diversified. So for venture capital, the product for the investors is growth. The product is not the technology, the product is also not the startup, the product is growth and valuation. And when the startup is big enough and can exit through various means, the investors get a large return. That's the idea. So with this dynamic in place, this logic in place, these drivers affecting defense, we have to think through what that ultimately means. So one of the things that we know from the private sector, for example, is that venture capital often wields an influence on the startup because obviously they finance the endeavor or the venture. But that means that the tech that is getting pushed is not always the best innovation or the most innovative innovation, but it is the technology that scales the best and the fastest. So, we have to look at the current context with drones, mass, attritable systems, maybe with that lens in mind. Is this the technology that's the most innovative, or is that the technology that scales companies the most quickly and the fastest and the largest? We also see in the industry that there's a focus on aerial drones. Sure, everybody's pivoting now to developing maritime drones, and there's a reason for that. There's also a different kind of pivot that prioritizes industrial manufacturing, whereby the core is automation in this manufacturing. So again, you have a kind of like a software-driven recapturing of industry as a kind of like a software manufacturing style industrial infrastructure. So really, what is the innovation here? Is it really innovation, or is it something that small companies can scale really fast? So the sector really focuses on words that we've already heard: speed and scale. Those are the core dynamics of venture capital: speed and scale, growth and risk. Regulation is kind of in the way for that because it slows things down, it provides a obstacle to getting companies to be able to contract with governments fast, test their prototypes, ideally in a live field or in some sort of like a suitable environment, and so on and so forth. So these companies are encouraged to make big promises, get prototypes out fast, test those prototypes, and then thrive on iteration of those prototypes. These are the dynamics I think we have to take into consideration. And so I want to just end, or I want to come back to the hype aspect. So we might want to think through this, what kind of dynamic this kicks loose. So different than it was before, they are making technologies that then are sold. If you have wares, if you have a product, you need a market, and you need a market that needs your wares, even if they're not finished or even if they're not even that useful. If you need to grow fast at a massive scale in order to survive, your company that is, and dominate in a market sense that is, you need to do what you have to do. You need to move fast and break things. In order to do this, you need an environment in which that kind of activity is tolerated. So crisis and urgency become key drivers for this dynamic. Crisis facilitates exception. Exceptions facilitate that one might work in the shadows, is obscured from view, at speed and scale. It allows for normal democratic processes and regulatory guidelines to be circumnavigated in the pursuit to drive up contracts and business and expansion. So then that puts the saber rattling or the war as a necessity for innovation in a perilous spot. When it becomes a key element in this innovation chain and this growth chain and in this capital return chain. So I would encourage us to cultivate greater sensibilities for what is in fact, what is in this hype, what is fact and what is fiction, what serves venture capital or private equity growth, and what serves stability or instability. And we also should, and this is my plea, to really seriously reconsider putting some of these new players that you mentioned. I don't want to talk about them because it just reaffirms their status. And I do think they're hype men, right? They're part of creating a hype for the products, of course, in the industry. So I think we need to reconsider putting some of these players on a pedestal because we think they have specialist knowledge about the future of war. They don't. There's a dynamic by which industry players with vested interests can capitalize on our perceived knowledge deficit. But they are experts primarily in business and sometimes technology, but they're not experts in political dynamics or the dynamics of warfare. And that is really important. So if we want to turn that card around, we're just going towards more conflict or at least the necessity for the possibility of conflict as a means to provide a market. And if we want to turn that around, we have to find ways to invest in maintaining peace and stability. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so before we get to questions from the audience, I would maybe like to invite our panelists if they want to react to something that has been said, or no? Should we just move on? Okay, all right, so let's move on to the questions from the audience. I'll collect three. So the first, second row, lady in the white shirt, and the lady in the second row here, and Oscar.
Hi, thanks a lot everyone for the panel. A lot of great insights. So I'm a graduate professional at Unidir, and my question, sorry? Oh, apologies. I think it will help if I held it closer. So I was wondering, beyond the challenges that emerging technologies pose for arms control, whether you see ways that they might also contribute positively to strengthening and supporting arms control efforts in the future. Thank you.
All right, can we get the mic? Oh, she did, okay. So then the gentleman in the third row in the middle, and then gentleman in the fourth row after.
Yeah, thank you for the contributions. My name is Oscar Proust, and I have a specific question to Cyril. Do you think the BWC can adapt to the AI biotech convergence, or has the biotechnology digital turn already outpaced the regime right now? And also, maybe this goes a little bit more into the direction of the colleague, does AI pose somehow also a chance for these existing institutions, or is it only a risk?
Okay, let's collect one more question.
Hi, thank you for your panel. It was really insightful. I'm Luca Sali. I'm a student at the University of Trento, and I have first a question for Cyril. You touched upon really briefly on non-state actors and how these technologies may enable them to construct and build biological weapons. You said that this is not a problem as for now, but we know that the pace of this technology is really fast. There are built-in mechanisms that stop large language models to give an answer on how to build a weapon or weaponize a pathogen. But do you think that these are enough, or should we do something more to prevent the possible diversion of this technology? And then there's a general question about data. So we know that AI basically works just on the data that we feed it. But we know that also collecting data is a problem. And it was briefly touched upon by Branka, so that when we test these machines in the laboratory is one thing, but then when we operationalize them in the battlefield or in any other environment is another field. So what do you think about the collecting of data, and how much of the bias that we have intrinsically may play a role also in shaping the way AI reacts to something or any event? Thank you.
All right, so I think we can start with the more general questions first. So the one about data collection and bias, and whether emerging technologies can also present an opportunity for arms control. Let's start with Branka.
Sure, yeah, I do think that AI can be helpful for arms control, and I can give you sort of a concrete example. We worked with just a very talented young AI researcher in Canada to develop a tool that would essentially sort of look for certain arms exports, and because the conventional arms trade is something my organization does as well. And that actually a few years ago that was a bit more challenging, and more recently we were able to sort of work with them to develop this tool that would sort of scan all of this information that's easily accessible, readily available, and that can help understand where the exports are and where they're going. So that sort of level of open source intelligence, combining that with some of these new tools is extremely helpful, and countries can do that. Countries have many more resources and tools to be able to do that. So absolutely redirecting some of the energy towards that and thinking through how do you do that. So for example, scanning. Years ago we were able to scan sort of information coming from the use of certain weapons in Yemen, and you can sort of say, okay, these are the weapons that came from this place in this country and this company. So you can really start to have an impact on export controls. And then the second question of data, absolutely, data is critical to the functioning of the systems. So some countries, use and will be using simulated data as well, which is very concerning, I think, when we're applying them to battle spaces, which have real consequences and real people in them. But there is a lot of data that's constantly collected. A lot of it doesn't get analyzed. So some of the, for example, Predator drones, they collect a lot of data, and takes humans a long time to go through some of that data. So there is an incredible amount of data collection that's already happening that is readily available to certain, and that's why I think Elke's point on these private actors really being engaged with is critical, because they have a lot of our data, right? I'm pretty sure Google has, a pattern of life on all of us, where we go, where we shop, what we do, our calendars, right? Thankfully, I'm not a person of interest to anyone, I think, so, I don't have to worry about it at the moment. But that's sort of the challenge. There is a lot of data already out there, and that's readily accessible. And I think there are contexts, like we haven't mentioned Gaza, for example, where when you combine that data with a country that feels under threat or has become under threat, the way it reacts to assert power, to show its population that it's in control, that's when I think you see some of the things that we have seen with the humanitarian consequences. So that's me all in there. Those are some of my concerns.
Perfect. Yeah. Let's go with Tong next.
I just want to add a quick comment on data collection. As I watch, I'm based in Washington, so I watch Western analysts collect data on Chinese nuclear or missile operation. In often cases, in the lack of nuanced understanding of Chinese internal thinking and way of behavior makes the data collection or the analysis of data detached from the cultural or political background that leads to misinterpretation. I think this challenge for machine collecting data is even worse, not least because on the enemy part, in the case of China, there's a lot of traditional emphasis on deception operations regarding missiles, missile, strike tactics. There are a lot of, research and planning on, setting up false infrared signal, to deceive and mislead enemy, early warning, etc., to, protect the real dimension of strike. So I think, I think this risk of, collecting biased data or misleading data and misinterpretation, if we highlight the risk enough, maybe it will help also change the enemy's behavior, making them more careful in planning deceptive military operations. But ultimately, I think the challenge to accurately collect and interpret data should keep us always maintain a healthy element of doubt about AI decision supporting and also to keep us debating what's the best balance to strike between automatic data collection analysis and human analysis of it.
Perfect. Elke?
Yes, Branka has already kind of said the things I probably would say. I mean, I do think AI can be used for arms control, but I maintain that we have to be very clear about what artificial intelligence is or does and what it is good for and what it is not good for. So object-oriented or object-focused kinds of tasks, sifting through a mass of data to find something very specific, not human related, or image recognition tools to identify misuse of munitions or the types of munitions that have been used. So I can see that, and I think these systems are very good. The danger is always that that one is pushed or encouraged to use it for absolutely everything, that you use this large language model for this and that, and to substitute for interpersonal relations. And I think that's the key part, is that no artificial intelligence systems can take on, but in using more AI in these interpersonal domains, things that relate humans to humans, from humans to humans, or between that exist between humans, an AI system can subvert that relationship. So again, I want to just make sure that we're clear that it's not the AI. An AI system is always very specific. It works with very specific data sets with very specific outcomes. And we need to find ways to limit the use for what it is good for. I do want to come to this data point. The age-old, I was talking to my father who was doing software in the 1980s or something. And he said it's the age-old problem, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you don't have enough relevant data, your system is going to be flawed. If you don't have sufficiently up-to-date data, your system will be flawed. These challenges have not gone away. They persist with, and the more sophisticated the technology becomes, the more problematic this requirement of good, relevant, accurate data will be. This also means that any adversary will poison your data. That is quite clear, right? So I think I would imagine there's an entire research effort somewhere underway to think about how to poison your adversary's data. So I think these things need to be taken into consideration. Then also this prioritization of data matters for how we then see consequences of how systems should be used. So we're thinking about Maven Smart System, for example, which NATO has acquired and which has been run by the US for a while. And it is a kind of like a pattern analysis identification system, to be just very crude about it. But the idea is to use it as an early warning system. The idea is that you have enough data to establish, and you hear a quote from a presentation, to establish a baseline for behaviors and equipment across the world, especially in hotspots where there might be irresponsible things that need to be found, right? So there's an overfitting or an over-understanding of what data can do, and an under-understanding or a lack of understanding as to how limited the data available in order to be able to do this well actually is. So data will continue to be a key problem.
Yeah, go ahead, Cyril.
Yeah, so I think I can answer the question about the strengthening of arms control through technology. And I think there are, for biology, at least two aspects there. The first one is the use of AI to parse open source intelligence. Traditionally, the problem, or one of the big problems with BTWC has been the lack of a verification mechanism, because it has been traditionally very difficult to identify a covert biological weapons program. They are, because of the dual-use potential of all this technology, it is very hard to make the difference between a facility producing several tons of anthrax and a facility producing food for chicken. But I think nowadays, with the knowledge and the tools we have, AI could really help analyzing patterns, for example, patterns of publications, hiring practices, funding practices in organization, to try to establish a baseline and see if they deviate, if there are some, for example, confidentiality or security measures that create a signal that could be explained by the presence of the covered program. I'm well aware that it is absolutely not a bulletproof solution. It will require a lot of work and will also probably generate some false signals, and it will be quite a challenge to think about what do you do when you have a signal, how do you investigate it, how do you reestablish confidence if it's a false signal. But I think this is one of the most obvious strengthening of arms control through technology. The other one that is really relevant for biology is it has to do with detection and attribution. I'm not a big believer of the use of biological weapons for mass destruction. I think we've had that capacity since at least the 60s, and really a capacity to create mass destruction, and it hasn't been used because states have realized that they have some better alternatives, some more effective alternatives. So for me, the future of biological weapons is really in terms of hybrid war, in terms of covert operation, and so on. And that potential usefulness, that potential usage, you can defeat it by strengthening your capacity to detect and attribute. And there we have a series of technologies that can really help that. Full genome sequencing, immediate sharing of sequence data, new detection technologies and so on that can really limit the incentive of using this kind of weapons for that purpose.
Okay, we have time for one more round of questions. So the first, I saw a lady in the white shirt there, and then the lady next to her.
I think, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Can I go? Yeah, sorry, Veronica. I think she was before me. But thank you very much for your discussions. My name is Chiara. I'm a policy intern at BASIC. I have a question for Tong. So you mentioned how, potential diplomatic talks between US and China could be explored by exploring topics such as outer space, missile defense, space-based interceptors. And I'm aware that these dialogues are taking place at a track 2 level, but I'm not that sure whether they are happening, in fact, at 1.5. If so, if you could shed light on that, and if they're not happening, what can the international community, or I guess other states, do to have these talks at a higher diplomatic level? Thank you.
All right. Can we do the lady next in the same row? Was it?
Yeah, hi. My name is Maria Mekri. I'm the head of a Finnish think tank called Safer Globe. I have a question about biothreats. For a while we were talking about biothreats to agriculture and tailored biothreats to certain kinds of agricultural products. Is this still a valid concern?
And then I think there was a question from the gentleman right there in the last row.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice session. I have a rather technical question because I remember reading something back in the time. On 5th of July, Palisade Research, they published a specific paper that has to do with the shutdown resistance in reasoning models. So I'm just interested, maybe Branka, because you worked with the Canadian military. Did you encounter such a problem? I mean, for the specialists, they know what I'm talking about. Or any one of you in your research. This specifically talks about the reluctance of the AI to shut down when specifically instructed or circumvent certain instructions in order to do something else. So, thank you.
I think we can collect one more because I didn't see previously. So if we could do one more question. Lady in the second row here. And these lights are blinding, so I can't really see all the hands. I'm sorry if I did anybody wrong.
Thank you very much. My name is Veronique. I am from the International Committee of the Red Cross. First of all, thank you for your fascinating presentation and very food for thought. I have a question. I have a comment and a question. As you may know, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the UN Secretary General made a call in 2023, and it's quite unique. It was the first time that our two institutions made a joint call for states to negotiate a legally binding on autonomous weapon system with the very original way of thinking, a clear prohibition, and also set some restriction. And I was wondering, you said that the time is not ripe, but when do you think that the time will be ripe to set a red line before we see this kind of system on the battlefield? And I think it might be much more difficult to regulate them when we have to deal with them on the battlefield. So if you can give us some advice how to convince states. Thank you.
Perfect. So I think we have a question for everybody on the panel, which is great. We can start with, I think, Elke and Branka, and then go to the questions about Fortong.
Yes, I'll be brief. It's so interesting with AI not shutting down in some ways. But I kind of want to take us back to the fact that AI is a mathematical statistical system. You know, it's not an entity that does its own thing. So I think, you know, it's an optimizing engine in the sense that it has a goal, and it will work towards that goal. And if it's a broad goal, it might work in ways that we don't understand, which might include not shutting down. But I think sometimes there's a risk with headlines like, oh God, it didn't shut down. It might develop its own survival mode. That we kind of valorize basic technology, mathematical technology or computational technology as something more than what it is, as something with its own intrinsic internal life, and it's not that. So I'm always a little bit cautious with that. It'd be really interesting to see what actually happened, mathematical processes, what was the outcome, what was the goal specified, and how, right? So here I'd really like to get more technical to kind of undermine or really better understand those headlines. The question on autonomous weapons regulation, I mean, the ICSC has done such great work with providing text, with providing the two-tier way of thinking about this is what we want to ban, this is not what we want to see, and everything else, you know, we can talk about it as long as it works with IHL. I think it's been a really powerful approach, I think, and increasingly we're seeing states finding it convincing, right? But it is, in some ways, this kind of speaks to the dynamics that I'm trying to tease out. I think we are in a kind of like a little bit of a combative situation in terms of industry interests and state interests. And I think we have to be clear about the fact that there are tensions there, that vested interests are being promoted in a way that sound like state interests, but they're not necessarily such. And I think a clearer understanding of that is really important. But I am very hopeful with the autonomous weapons regulatory space, even though it's taken a very long time. But progress has been made, and I think it's on the right track.
Perfect.
Thank you for the question. And I have the very enviable sort of role of providing advice and consulting with the Department of Defense, but not being accountable for anything, or not, not actually being responsible. So I'm just going to tell you sort of some of the thinking, and the challenge really is this question of alignment. The AI community talks about alignment. How do you get the system to do what you want it to do consistently? And in a safety critical context, in a military context, that's not an option, right? And at times it's not about being a nice, responsible actor. It's about really ensuring that you're deploying systems that won't cause harm to whether your strategic interests or whether to your own force. So I think the issue really was one of trying to understand, this black box of AI and which systems are used and in which context. And they're still very much working on it. And I think sometimes the hype drives this perception that anything goes and everything goes, and that's not the reality. The other challenge there's so much to talk about, so we haven't talked about, but the interaction of more autonomous systems with, human-operated systems are another challenge. We don't know how the human operator will react in certain situations when when teaming, right? Human-machine teaming is a challenge as well. So there is, I think, a lot of interest, though, in understanding this, and that's where the one thing I didn't talk about on governance, which I should have, is that we need national policies. In addition to all of these, international dialogues, we need national policies. And Canada does have, responsible AI defense policy. It's one of the first countries to have it. But it's more of like a guideline. It's not a policy. So it needs to be worked on. And I think it'd be really great for European countries to show leadership, for middle powers to show leadership and to develop some of those policies and to start that dialogue. Very quickly, when's the time to regulate autonomous weapons? Yesterday. And we could have done it, The dialogue started in 2014. There could have been a very clear sort of specificity to exactly what you were banning. And I think at that time, states were saying, we don't know what we're talking about, But we do know. We know what the most concerning uses are, and we need to focus on those uses. I know China, for example, has, supported a ban on on offensive autonomous weapons, but said, we need to keep defensive autonomous weapons. Maybe Tong engaged them on saying, well, that line isn't actually a real one. What is an offensive system can be a defensive system, So we need to talk about how do we get these countries to really focus on the most harmful, most critical applications. And really, I think it has to do with demystifying the topic and really understanding where are the issues. It's not Skynet, right? It's not something taking over. It's introducing a lot more autonomy into existing platforms and existing systems that would allow them to engage and select targets. That's it. That's the red line. And if you can draw that, I think that would be extremely helpful, because the dynamics that Elke outlined mean that those scale-ups, those startups, they're going to have to start testing. They're going to have to start battle testing their technology. And Palantir has battle tested its technology, for example, in Ukraine. So that's where my concern is. These technologies will start being tested.
Okay, just very briefly, we have 4 minutes. So if each could react in 2 minutes max. Tong, let's start with you.
I'll just focus on Chiara's question on how to move to official level arms control engagement with China. Firstly, I think track 2 dialogue is still badly needed, and we need more, precisely because the obstacle for China to be interested in arms control is the genuine lack of appreciation of the consequences of its build-up and the crisis instability that its capabilities and new postures are generating. So to build that genuine appreciation of risk is first step, and that can be better achieved firstly by engaging with experts. But it's also important to have official level engagement. I have two brief points. One is on the substance. I think, again, I think there is need to more openly and flexibly engage with China's counter proposals. No first use is a good example. There are many inconsistencies or conflicting points underlying China's no first use. For example, there is, China doesn't commit to not making threat of nuclear first use in a conventional war. It only commits to no actual use of nuclear weapons in a conventional war, which contrasts with China's other commitments. If you look at China's negative security assurance to non-nuclear weapon states, China commits to no use of nuclear weapons, but also no threat of use against non-nuclear weapon states. When it comes to biological weapons, chemical weapons, China commits to both no use and no threat of use. But when it comes to no first use, it only commits to no use, but leaves open the option of making nuclear threat, which is the way to, conducting nuclear signaling in a conventional crisis. So that could be a useful opportunity to ask tough questions. And also, how does China distinguish actual nuclear use and a nuclear demonstration shot? A demonstration shot against high sea or low Earth orbit that doesn't kill anyone, does that cross the threshold of nuclear first use? Right? So good questions to engage with China. That's the way to pragmatically conduct this dialogue, and also to, use China's own principles. China embraces the principle of undiminished security for all, which basically means no one's defense capability should threaten others' security. But ask China how to apply this to the current regional arms race in East Asia, where China is leading the development and deployment of massive theater-range missiles. How, what types of theater-range missile development or deployment should be viewed as overly threatening to other countries? I think that's the more useful way to engage. And very quickly on format, the pressure, the coercive pressure on China to join arms control shouldn't come from the United States. It should come from European countries, should come from global South countries, because these countries have political leverage over China, and it's important for European countries to engage with global South countries and to raise the awareness that even limited nuclear use over Taiwan scenario, for example, would have very negative consequences for other neighboring countries. And China's reliance on counter space have global consequences for everyone. The insistence of the Trump first administration on US, Russia, China trilateral format and the coercive pressure directly from the United States is a key reason that the prior effort to engage China failed.
Okay, I think we would be going over, so one sentence or two sentences, if you could.
Very quick. I think, yes, the concern about agricultural, the targeting of agricultural by biological weapon is a very relevant concept, because it talks into what I mentioned earlier, the ability to perform gray zone area attacks, so escalating without passing a certain threshold, and because within that area there's very little of that detection capability and attribution capability, even less than there is for humans.
Okay, great. So join me now in a round of applause for our panel.